Hello, I'm Paul Pirello, and welcome to the Philly Factor. He was born on January 19th, 1809 in Boston, where his mother had been employed as an actress. He moved to Philadelphia in 1838, where he lived for 6 years, where he became famous with the success of his poem, The Raven. His home in Old City still stands today as a tribute to the literary genius. But the anniversary of his death in 1849 in Baltimore has stirred up a great debate these days. Does Edgar Allan Poe belong to the city where he died or Philadelphia, where he wrote one of his greatest literary works? And why is it that biographers of Poe recount his stay in Philadelphia as only a brief one? Well, here to help us understand the legacy of Edgar Allan Poe, his literary contributions, and whether he belongs to Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, where he was born, or the world, is Edward Pettit, known affectionately as the Philly Poe guy. Mr. Pettit is a freelance writer and book reviewer and teaches writing at Salle University. And Edward, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
So this big debate sort of bubbles up to the top, and you sort of wrote an article for City Paper about Edgar Allan Poe. Let's right from the start say that most people know Edgar Allan Poe for his literary works. They know that he wrote The Raven. Many Philadelphians, many people in general, may not know that he supposedly wrote The Raven while he lived here in Philadelphia.
He began The Raven in Philadelphia. He did finish it after his move to New York. And New York City is actually where he achieved his greatest celebrity. But it certainly was not where he wrote his greatest works and did the great a lot of the great stuff that we remember him for, that was in Philadelphia.
Yep. So there's this house that's part of the Independence National Historical Park. Many people probably don't even know that there's a home in the park, famous for Carpenter's Hall and Independence Hall, and the Betsy Ross House, the Liberty Bell Pavilion. They may not even know that Edgar Allan Poe lived here for a while.
Yeah, the house is a little off the beaten path too, because it's not around all those other history sites. It's at 7th and Spring Garden, and Poe lived in about 6 or 7 different residences in the city, and this is the last one standing. None of the others exist anymore. And the Park Service took it over in the late 70s and have restored it in a sense. What they've done is they've restored it back to the condition, at least they've stripped the walls down and things like that, back to the level they would have been when Poe lived there, but they haven't furnished it. And there's cracks in the walls and things like that. And those kind of things they leave blank. The rooms are empty, so it seems a little creepy when you're going in there. The basement especially is very creepy. There's cobwebs, real spiders are down there, and it's real creepy the way they've maintained it. And that's a nice it's a nice thing that they've done for the legacy of Poe, I think, that people visit it, and they haven't tried to recreate what his rooms may have looked like, because we have no idea.
Sure. So let's talk a little bit about Edgar Allan Poe, the person then, okay? As I said, he's born in Boston.
He's born in Boston.
His mother's an actress, and then his mother dies at a young age, right?
Yes.
And he's taken in by another family?
He is. He's taken in by the Allans. They're a wealthy merchant family in Richmond, and that's where his mother dies because she's on tour. I mean, he's born in Boston only because that's the city. His mother happens to be on tour as an actress when she has the baby, and she's on tour again, and she's in Richmond, and she dies. And she was a little bit famous in her time as an actress. People certainly knew who she was. So when she was ill and dying of consumption or tuberculosis, as we call it now, there was a movement to have her children taken care of. She had 3 children. Poe also had a brother and a sister. So when she was on her deathbed, people were saying someone should take care of her, and the Allan family stepped in and took Edgar. His sister went to another family, and his brother went to another. I think his brother stayed with Edgar's grandfather.
He's not the ideal student, though, when he gets of age to go to school.
Yeah, he's
not like LaSalle student.
He's actually a brilliant student at first. And this happens at several stages in his life. He starts on an endeavor, and he's brilliant, and everyone recognizes how brilliant he is. But then other factors come into play, usually personal factors, and he can't continue. In school, his father sends him to school, but only kind of pays his tuition, doesn't even give him enough money for books, and Edgar has no money. And he's in University of Virginia at the time, which is mostly these landed, Virginia children with lots of money, and Poe figures the only way he can get some money is to gamble with them, play cards with them. It's a disaster. He might have been brilliant, but he certainly was not a good card player. Ran up huge debts, and when his father heard, he was furious and refused to help pay anymore, and Edgar had to come home.
So when does this stroke of genius set in that he's able to write, and not just write a 500-word composition, but able to write some great literary works? When does that kick in?
He wants to be a great poet, and he's composing poetry at a young age as a teenager, and publishes his first book of poetry when he's a very young man, and it goes nowhere, of course. And now it's one of the most famous books of poetry you can have. It's called Tamerlane and Other Poems, and it doesn't even have Poe's name on it. It's by a Bostonian, because Boston is the poetry capital of the United States at the time. That's where you want to be accepted as a poet. So Poe releases that, and he's born there, so he can have some kind of claim to the city. But it goes nowhere, and there were so few copies that were distributed anyway. I think there's only about 13 or 14 that survive today. If you find one, it's worth millions. But he's writing poetry from a young age, and it doesn't really get anywhere. But at the same time, the magazine industry is exploding, and the penny press comes into being in the 1830s, and Poe finds a way to at least make a bare subsistence living doing journalism work and writing for the magazines, and that's when he that's where he develops what I think we recognize as his greatest talent is as a short story writer, and he's doing that for the magazines.
What brings him to Philadelphia then?
Philadelphia is perhaps the publishing capital of the country at the time. Wow. It shares that distinction with New York and Boston, but Philadelphia is certainly the magazine capital of the United States in the 1830s and 1840s. The magazine industry explodes in Philadelphia, and Poe becomes an editor of a magazine and a couple magazines. And the last one was Burton's magazine in Philadelphia. When Poe starts as editor of Burton's, it has a circulation of about 5,000, I think, and in a couple years it's 37,000. Wow. Poe is a very successful editor. He knows how to pick writers and put a good magazine together. His pieces in it, of course, help considerably as well. And that's why he's in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia doesn't get recognized. I think the literary culture of Philadelphia doesn't get recognized in that age. And it's in a significant literary culture in all of American literary history, in that not only because of the magazine industry and the development of the short story, which happens in magazines, but also because there's a kind of school of literature that's really centered in Philadelphia, and I call it Philadelphia Gothic, and there's a couple other scholars right now who are calling it Philadelphia Gothic, and where American writers have adopted this horror Gothic European tradition and have adapted it to American themes and places and settings, and that actually begins in Philadelphia with Charles Brockden Brown in the late 18th century. And Poe comes into that environment, and lots of writers have been inspired by Brockden Brown, Poe included, to continue that tradition. You could go back and read some of these magazines that Poe's writing for at the time, and you'll find other Gothic stories. Other Gothic writers at the time were George Leppard and Robert Montgomery Bird, and these are all major Philadelphia writers. A lot of Gothic novels, whether they be American set Gothic or just traditional European kind of Gothic, all this stuff is being published in Philadelphia at the time. So much so that sometimes a writer would write a Gothic work and it would be, instead of putting their name on it, it would be by a Philadelphian or by, something like that. And so people were associating Philadelphia at the time with Gothic works in America. So of course, Poe's put into this environment, and that's the kind of great stuff that he produces.
So prior to coming to Philadelphia and writing in this American Gothic style, if you will, his works before this, did it show any inkling of this type of writing?
He's definitely attracted to the macabre, to the kind of horror works. The first horror work he wrote is called Metzengerstein, and it's a very traditional European kind of Gothic story. And he's writing his tales in Baltimore at first. He's only in Baltimore for a very short time, a couple years he lives there. But that's where he begins his writing career. Sure. Although the first 6 stories he writes while he's living in Baltimore are all published in Philadelphia publications, because this is where you get published. Right. And then he writes a story called Berenice, and it's a horrific story, and at the ending is very over the top. The grave gets violated and the corpse gets mutilated. And Poe actually has to write an apology because it's so gruesome in the next issue of this magazine that he publishes it in. So he has he definitely has an attraction to this kind of material. But in Philadelphia, it's when he comes to Philadelphia that it takes on that urban feel to it, that he's writing not in the European tradition of Gothic anymore, but the American tradition of Gothic is very urban.
One would have to wonder, is there anything in his early years, in his childhood, his teenage years, that sort of influenced him or had an impact on him to sort of write in this way?
It's always tough to kind of look at works of fiction and poetry, I think, and pull biography out of them. You can see certain themes in that continue in his works that he was certainly affected in his real life as well. He once stated that the death of a beautiful woman is the most poetical topic. And he does that in all his poems, The Raven's about that, and a young woman dying. And all the young women in his life seem to die, and almost all of them, of consumption. I was giving a lecture for 8th grade class and trying to explain this about Poe, and I summarized it by saying, if you're a girl and Poe likes you, look out, because you're going to die. It's his mother, there's a young woman who's a mother of a friend of his who's very close to him when he's young. She dies of consumption. His wife famously dies as well. His brother as well. So,
you sort of then stir up this great debate, if you will, that Poe perhaps should be interred, buried here in Philadelphia, as opposed to Baltimore, where he dies. It just seems to me that Philadelphia played a much bigger role in his life and his career than perhaps the history books or the literary societies want to give Philadelphia credit for. But so when you sort of propose this, I mean, are you serious in that his body should be exhumed and brought to Philadelphia, maybe interred at the Poe House, or are we just talking figuratively here as opposed to literally?
It's always been a metaphor for me that it's a metaphor for his literary legacy belongs to Philadelphia. He's really a Philadelphia writer, not a Baltimore writer. I mean, he only died there because he was passing through. Never really had a strong connection to the city. He had family there, and he lived there a couple years. But he doesn't have strong connection, especially when you look at his works, and if that's what we're remembering him for, he doesn't have a strong connection to Baltimore at all. But hey, if I were king, absolutely, I would move his bones to Philadelphia because this is where they belong. That would never happen, of course, and Baltimore has done a tremendous job maintaining the Poe literary legacy. I just get very frustrated when people automatically associated him with Baltimore. When the mayor of Baltimore went on for the Poe Bicentennial, was announcing their events, she's introducing the event. She was saying that Poe was born in Baltimore, and he wasn't. I think the impression people get now is Poe was probably born there and spent his whole life there, and Baltimore's all about him. And actually, Baltimore didn't want any parts of him when he died. There was 4 people, I think, at his burial.
Really?
His cousin and a family friend and the preacher, and I think the gravedigger. So much so that the preacher had planned a long oration, and when nobody was there, he just said a couple words, and that was it. There was no grave marker for almost 20 years.
Really?
And it's when Poe becomes world famous, about 20 years later, that Baltimore all of a sudden realizes, hey, he's buried here. We should say he's of Baltimore, and they've been doing it ever since. Philadelphia has all sorts of things that they've been well known for history, and I don't think they've ever felt the need to reappropriate arguably still the most famous American writer.
Sure.
But when you have a city with the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall and Ben Franklin and even Rocky, you don't kind of need any more tourist attractions.
Right.
but it's a matter of literary history, and that's what I like to go out and talk about.
Now, he dies in Baltimore, though, not under the greatest circumstances. I mean, it's not like he's on horseback and he falls off, hits his head, goes into a coma. I mean, he's sort of like down and out in his luck. He's on a drunken binge. We
don't know. No one knows what he died of. It is not even certain that he was drunk at the time. All we know is he was found delirious on the streets. In clothes that were not his own, which is very unusual. Nobody can. That mystery has always fueled the conspiracy mills. Is how did he get in these other clothes? Sure. Nobody knows why he was in Baltimore. He was supposed to be stopping in Philadelphia and then traveling on to New York. So no one knows even why. It's about 4 or 5 days that are missing right before the end that no one knows what happened to him. It's always been assumed that he died of drinking or drugs or anything like that. And actually, Poe never did drugs. He was not a drug addict at all in his life. He may have tried opium once, but that's not even certain that he even did it once. And his drinking problems, I think, are often exaggerated. Because he did have a problem with drinking, and that every now and then he would go off on a bender and get very drunk for a couple days and say some things to people that wasn't good. But it also appears that when he did drink, if he would have 1 or 2 drinks, he was on the floor. He couldn't actually do anything. And if you look at the body of work he's producing at the time, especially in Philadelphia, he couldn't have been drinking. I mean, he was a serious, dedicated professional writer, day in, day out, writing as much as he possibly could. And every now and then he would go on a bender, and it would hurt him professionally.
Sure.
But he was certainly not some kind of raging everyday alcoholic, as I think a lot of people picture him.
Yeah, I guess with the anniversary of his death, there's sort of this. You talk about bizarre situation, but at least from news media accounts, is that there's always someone that is seen going into the cemetery where he is buried. Sort of a figure that no one can, they don't know if it's a man, if it's a woman, dark cloak, and maybe I'm exaggerating, but they go in and they lay a flower on his grave, and nobody knows who it is.
It's they call him the Poe Toaster, and it is a man. Life magazine was allowed to take a picture from a distance in the dark one night, about 1980, I think. And the people who maintain the grave in Baltimore know that it's a man, but they don't know who it is, and they've never wanted to know who it was, because then they know the secret and they'd be responsible for maintaining it. All they do at the gravesite, at Poe's gravesite, it's Westminster Burial Yard in Baltimore, is they leave the gate open at night and hope that he can get in, because crowds show up. Now, the original toaster did die several years ago. They know, or the torch was passed. He left a note saying the torch is passed, and they're pretty certain that maybe it's a son, or it might even be a couple sons that now carry the tradition on. I went out last year. Not the bicentennial of the year before in 2008 in January, and stayed out all night, and watched, because the toaster always comes between midnight and 6 a.m. Confounded us that year because he came at 11:30. But I actually saw him. There was only a handful of us who actually saw him come in from down the street. We could see him walk up and go in the side gate and go back, and he leaves 3 red roses and a half-filled bottle of cognac. People assume the 3 red roses are for Poe, and his wife and his mother-in-law are now reinterred there with him. So perhaps the roses are for the 3 of them, but no one really understands because he has a reputation of drinking. But why is it half full? I don't know. I asked the curator if I could have a sip, but he wouldn't let me.
The bicentennial year that we're experiencing on the death of Edgar Allan Poe, that really, I guess,
it's the bicentennial of his birth.
Of his birth, you're right. So now all this attention is focused once again on Edgar Allan Poe. That I guess is a good thing, because we now start to get a better handle on who he was, where he lived, Philadelphia's role, obviously, in his life and his career. So that's a good thing, because maybe it takes a pivotal anniversary like this, the 200th anniversary of his birth, that sort of refocuses our attention on Edgar Allan Poe. We know who he was, we knew where he lived, we know there's this house in Old City, but now we may have a better understanding and appreciation of not only him, but maybe other literary geniuses that are out there.
And there's a bunch of them. That period in literary history, for Philadelphia especially. George Lepard is a friend of Edgar Allan Poe's, and is a writer in Philadelphia at the time. He writes a novel called The Quaker City, or The Monks of Monk Hall. It is the best-selling novel in America until Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's an enormous novel, and it's a great novel. It's lurid, gothic, fun. There's a mansion and this hunchbacked monster guy that keeps the door, and there's murders in it, and it's a fun read, and it's exciting, And these are the kind of works that would be written in Philadelphia at the time.
Yeah. Now, the Poe House has just been reopened to the public to visit. It was closed there for some type of refurbishment right before the bicentennial kicked off. And so people that are paying a visit to Old City, it is north of what we would call the historic district, because you said 7th Spring Garden. And so again, people can sort of see, and this was one of the homes that Poe lived in. So was this always part of National Historical Park there in Independence Hall, that area?
No, Richard Gimbel of the Gimbel family, from Gimbel's in Philadelphia, the department stores, Gimbel was a huge Poe collector. And when he saw the house was up for sheriff's sale, I think during the Depression in the 30s, he jumped on it and bought it. And then he maintained it as an Edgar Allan Poe museum. And he put furniture in there, this Victorian, 19th century-like furniture, and he had all sorts of artifacts in there. And it was maintained up until his death. And at his death, he willed it to the Free Library, along with his collection. And the Free Library has the collection now, and the Gimbel Poe collection, the Free Library, is one of the greatest Poe collections in the world. They've loaned it out, parts of it now are touring in other parts of the country for the bicentennial. But the library didn't know what to do with the house, because they don't know how to maintain something like that. So they gave it to the city, and the city didn't know what to do with it either. So they asked the Park Service, and the Park Service said sure, and they took it over, I think it's 1978. So it's actually by law, and it's the wording in the law is something like, Philadelphia is in charge of the legacy of Edgar Allan Poe or something like that. So I like to tell people, by law, Philadelphia gets the legacy. That's right. Because it's your tax dollars for the National Park Service. Yeah. And they've done a wonderful job. And their new exhibit is really great. The exhibit that was there before, as you go in, there's just an exhibit area before you go in the house, was supposed to be a temporary exhibit, opened in 1980. And so now they find, and it's a beautiful exhibit with lots of interactive things for kids and everything. It's really nice. Yeah,
and the thing is that if, as I said, people may not know that this house exists. It's there. People could go and visit. You might want to go and either call the Independence National Historical Park to find out the exact hours that the home is open, what days of the week that it's open. I'm guessing
it's Wednesday to Sunday, 9 to 5.
Okay, and again, this is it's great whether you are just looking to tour Independence National Historical Park, and if you're up at 4th and Arch, it's only a few blocks over. 4th and Arch is where the Betsy Ross house is, just a few blocks off there at 7th and Spring Garden. You could visit the Poe House. When you think of Edgar Allan Poe and the fact that he was a writer, is there anything that he documented, anything that he wrote about that sort of puts him in Philadelphia at this period of time? I mean, are there any records where he sort of, kept a diary of his time in Philadelphia?
We don't have there are plenty of historical records of places where he lived, and not long ago we discovered some bankruptcy papers that he had filed while he was in Philadelphia. In his stories, he writes these, stories set in urban areas, these great urban Gothic stories, and Philadelphia is never named. It's usually another city is named. And Poe's famous for that because I think he has the idea that he wants his literature to be not associated with a particular place, that he wants it to be seen as more universal. So often the places aren't named, and even if they are, it's usually somewhere in Europe. So he doesn't name Philadelphia, but when you read Philadelphia history and you go back and you research, and then you read some of these stories, it's right there. He's describing the city around him, and he was famous in his time for writing an essay about the Wissahickon Valley. It was called "Morning on the Wissahickon." The Wissahickon Valley was a place that Poe loved, and would go walking through the woods there and take a little boat along the creek, as a lot of people did then. And Poe loved that area, and he wrote a wonderful little essay about it as well.
So, as a student then at LaSalle High School, then LaSalle University, what turned you on to Edgar Allan Poe?
I'm asked this all the time, and I don't have that, Poe story that I was 11 and sick for a week and consumed all the works. I've just always been interested in this kind of literature. I've always been interested in horror and darker kind of literature, as well as everything else. Poe, I always read Poe and very much enjoyed reading Poe. But for me, it's not just Poe for me, though. It's the Philadelphia connection, and that's what really got me going to talk about Poe. Is that not only do I get to talk about Poe, but I get to talk about Philadelphia and its history at that time.
But as a writing instructor, writing professor here at LaSalle, obviously there had to be some type of influence that Poe had on you directly or indirectly, because it's not like you decided to go and major in physics. I mean, so there's got to be some type of connection between you and Poe.
I think so, and it's not necessarily from the literary side so much now as it is from the writing side, because I'm a professional writer, and Poe was, and made a miserable living at it. And I commiserate how hard it is to make a living as a writer, and so I do get a lot of inspiration from Poe as a writer, to see how hard he worked and how much he produced. And while he didn't get very much from it, he still kept at it all the time. And that's a little inspiring to look at.
I want you to mention your website, because it is a mouthful, so I'm going to have you mention your website.
It's the Bibliothecary blog. It's a blog site, the Bibliothecary. If you Google my name, Pettit, P-E-T-T-I-T, and Poe, it's pretty easy to find me on the web. But I maintain a few blogs. One's the Bibliothecary blog, in which I blog about all things literary. And there's also an Ed and Edgar blog, which is about myself and all the things that I do with Poe, and all the things I find around the internet.
You're a great supporter of Edgar Allan Poe, a great resource on Edgar Allan Poe, as well as the Poe House in Philadelphia. And I know you also tour the area, tour the country, if you will, speaking about Edgar Allan Poe. So again, and I know you participated in a program probably a few weeks ago at the Free Library, where this debate about where Poe really belongs sort of bubbled up to the top.
That was in January. We had the great Poe debate, and it was myself for Philadelphia and Jeff Jerome for Baltimore, who maintains the Poe House and Museum in Baltimore, and Paul Lewis from Boston, where Poe was born. Boston has jumped into the fray now and says, no, he was born in Boston. If you're celebrating the bicentennial, you should be celebrating Boston. And there's actually going to be a debate at the end of this year in December in Boston, and we're still trying to figure out how we're going to do a debate in Baltimore. All
right. Well, it's been a fascinating program here, and Ed Pettit, I want to thank you for your time. Continued success, best of luck. And all things considered, when it comes to Edgar Allan Poe, he belongs here in Philadelphia.
Thank you so much.
All right, Ed Pettit on this edition of The Philly Factor. We thank you so much for being with us on our program. Until the next time, my name is Paul Perillo. Thanks for watching The Philly Factor.